Hello and welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is episode 24, The Age of Imperialism. When talking European imperialism, you want to think about it in two stages. The first stage started in 1492 when Christopher Columbus sailed to America, and this stage continued throughout the 15, 16, and 1700s with Spain and Portugal in South America and Mesoamerica, and French, Great Britain, and the Dutch in North America, and all of them in the Caribbean. So we looked at these colonial experiences in Unit 3. The time period that we're working with here for Unit 4 is 1750 to 1900, and during these 150 years or so, we see a second wave of European colonialism, and this time it's towards Asia and Africa, not the Western Hemisphere. Last week we looked at China and the Ottoman Empire, which both became dependent on the West, and in this podcast I'm going to be talking about the colonies that came under direct colonial rule by Western powers. Okay, so who are these Western powers or European powers in the 19th century? In the last unit, we talked about the main colonizers being the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the French. Now, in this time period, the 1750 to 1900, we see some new emerging powers. Both Germany and Italy become countries in 1871, and they both are able to become colonial powers. Belgium joins the ranks of European powers, and as you heard last week, both the United States and Japan also become world powers. As far as Spain and Portugal, both become less influential between the years 1750 to 1900. We have widespread Latin American independence movements, and these two old colonial powers become less powerful, less influential. There are some key differences between the first and second waves of colonialism. The biggest difference is that in America, Eurasian disease had an extremely devastating effect on the indigenous people, and disease didn't have nearly the effect in Asia and Africa. The biggest similarity to the colonization of America is that Europeans, and now other world powers, used their superior military technology to build their empires. So it was always military force, or at the very least the threat of using military force, that helped Europeans build their empires. They had an overwhelming advantage when it came to firepower. They had quick-loading rifles, machine guns, better vehicles. But like in America, not all people gave in to the demands of their colonizers, and they fought to defend their homelands, and these colonial powers often had to fight long and had to fight hard to create their new empires. So there were countless wars of conquest in the 19th century. All these conflicts were different in one way or another, but the outcome was pretty much the same across the board. Europeans, and in some cases Americans or Russians or Japanese, prevailed because they had superior military power. So the effect of this second wave of European colonialism was that African and Asian people of all kinds, whether it be hunter-gatherers in Australia and New Zealand, subsistence farmers in the South Pacific and West Africa, nomadic pastoralists in the Sahara and Central Asia, as well as hundreds of millions of people living in advanced complex civilizations like India or Indonesia, all lost freedom. And in some of these new colonies, European control grew out of earlier presence in the area. So a good example of this would be India. In Unit 3, we looked at how the British Crown allowed the British East India Company to set up shop in Mughal, India. The presence of the British East India Company gave Great Britain essentially a foothold in India. So when the global balance of power shifted towards Europe, the British East India Company was in a position to take control of India. And a similar situation happens in Indonesia, where the Dutch move from having this trading post empire to turning Indonesia into an outright colony. So if India and Indonesia are two examples of European colonization that took place over an extended period of time, the majority of Africa, of Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific experienced colonialism much more abruptly. In Africa, between the years 1875 and 1900, we have a period of intense colonization where European powers essentially carve up the entire continent and draw arbitrary lines. Just about the entire continent comes under colonial rule of one European power or another. So, a term that's often used to describe this process is the scramble for Africa. At the end of the 19th century, there was this intense competition among European powers to lay claim to territory and claim the natural resources for themselves. In Africa, the societies that were the easiest for Europeans to conquer were societies where there was a strong central government, and this is because the centralized government was already in place. Once the centralized government was defeated, the colonizing power could negotiate with the government, and everybody underneath the central government would be easy to control because that structure was already in place, or that control structure was already in place. This is different in a lot of the decentralized, stateless societies that didn't have a central authority, and it was these decentralized, stateless societies that were the hardest for Europeans to conquer, because this often meant fighting village to village and conquering village to village. In Australia and New Zealand, the process was much more similar to European colonization of the Americas. The British came in the 19th century, and British colonization was accompanied by massive European settlement. Like in America, the indigenous people were also decimated by disease. More than 50% were wiped out as a result of these diseases. So Australia, New Zealand essentially became settler colonies for the British. Today, the Aborigines in Australia are only 2.4% of the population. In New Zealand, the indigenous Maori are 15% of the population. Like I mentioned earlier, we also have some new imperial powers in the 19th century, namely Japan, Russia, and the United States. Korea and Taiwan are spared from Western domination because they're conquered by Japan. Russia will push deeper into Central Asia, and the United States will push all the way to the Pacific Ocean, becoming essentially what we know as the United States today, or the lower 48 states at least. So we really have a reshaping of the globe into two camps: world powers and colonies, subjugators and subjects, oppressors and oppressed. There have certainly been empires in the past, but now we're really at a point in history where the entire world is controlled by a dozen or so world powers, and there are some exceptions, but not many. In Africa, Ethiopia managed to avoid colonization. In Asia, Thailand avoided colonization. And we have some newly independent states in the Americas. But the broad pattern, the big picture that we see in the 19th century is that European powers, plus Japan, Russia, the United States, conquered the rest of the world. And there were really thousands of variations of this encounter, but the outcome was that the superior military power won out. But how different Asian and African societies responded to this process of colonization varied quite a bit from society to society.